as well as qualifying as an accountant because of your technical skills, the ACCA are also very interested in your management skills, particularly in Chapter 4, managing yourself. So the idea behind what we're going to be talking about in Chapter 4 is how you can improve as a worker in the workplace. Now, obviously, they are interested in this because you want to get a better job, you want to get a better career, and the kind of people that tend to do well inside organisations are not necessarily those with the best technical skills. They are the people who are most effective. In other words, they get things done. ACCA wants ACCA students to be the people that get things done. So they want you to be effective. So one of the things that we're going to look at is we're going to think about how can you be effective as a person. And then when we've done that, you can also think about how you could get the people who work for you to be effective. Because as we said in the previous chapter, when you are a manager, one of the routes to success as being a manager, again, is nothing to do with your technical ability. It's going to be, does your department get the work done? And if the answer is yes, you are more likely to get promotions. ACCA want their students to become the people who get promoted, the people who end up being the finance directors of an organisation, maybe even running the entire organisation. One of the big things is personal effectiveness. Now, there is lots and lots and lots of material, literature about personal effectiveness. We are only going to scratch the surface of it. But we're going to do some basic stuff that we can talk about when we're talking about how you can be more effective in your job. Now, obviously, we are studying it because we want to get through the exam, but I hope that you will find there are some ideas in Chapter 4 that are actually you can use at work to improve what you are doing. So, personal effectiveness, there's going to be a number of different topics within here. The first of them is what's called communication. So that's what we're going to begin with. Communication. What exactly do we mean by communication? It's something which involves the exchange of information. It could be one person telling somebody else. It could be two people having a conversation. It could be somebody sending an email to 1,000 other people inside an organisation. So communication can be written, it can be spoken. It can be one person to one person, it can be one person to many people. So the idea is that it's information which is being exchanged. Now, communication is vital inside an organisation. And in many organisations, because communication is not as good as it could be, the entire organisation can start having difficulties. I am sure inside the organisation that you work for, whoever that is, there have been times when you might have been doing some work which proved to be unnecessary, or your department might have been doing something because they weren't told that another department had already done something. Now, there's lots of times when communication inside organisations is not particularly good. It leads to people wasting their time doing things they didn't need to. It leads to people becoming frustrated and annoyed because they weren't able to do the things that they thought they were supposed to be doing. So communication, very, very, very important. It's becoming even more important as we get people who work for organisations that are global, that are based around the world. We are getting more information more often. It's constant if you're working in an organisation. So the idea is that we need to think about what communication is so that we do it properly. So, first of all, why is communication important at all? Well, sharing ideas. That's obviously one of the biggest things inside an organisation. our little part of the organisation has done something that worked really well, we want to share that with everybody else. We want to tell them what we did so that they can copy what we did and emulate it. Or, here is something the organisation is now decided to change the way it does something, and they're going to let everybody know about it. So there's lots and lots and lots of ideas sharing that goes on inside an organisation. It can be used to give instructions. From now on, I want everybody inside the organisation to do this whenever they deal with a customer. So you are telling people what to do. It provides feedback. So we followed your instructions, we treated customers the way that you said, and customers responded to that. We have had a much more positive comments from our customers. So it's a good idea. You will notice that those two, in a way, are similar. Giving instructions will tend to be the people at the top giving instructions to the people at the bottom. Giving feedback is often the opposite direction. It's the people at the bottom giving feedback to the people at the top. So, we want you to do it like this. We did it the way you wanted. This was the results. So those two work very closely together. And finally, addressing people's social needs. Humans are very sociable creatures. They like to talk to each other. They like to communicate with each other. If any of you have ever seen any films that are set in a prison of any kind, one of the worst punishments that a prisoner can get is to be sent to solitary confinement, because that way they cannot communicate with anybody else. And as I say, that's usually the worst punishment that is restricted for somebody who has really done something wrong. It's becoming more and more of an issue because there are now more and more workers who actually work from home, in effect voluntarily putting themselves in solitary confinement. There will be people who work from home and actually don't speak to anybody else at all for vast parts of the day. So we like to communicate with others, whether it's talking to them, whether it's written via things like texting or emailing or instant messaging, or however it is, people need to communicate with others, and work provides that. So, one of the things that we have to think about is what's called the communication process. How do we actually communicate with others? How do they find out what we are actually talking about? How do they find out what we want? Well, the communication process starts out with somebody who has some information, the sender. What they will need to do is they will need to do what's called encoding the message. They will have to think, what am I going to do in order to let somebody else know about this? Now, if they are speaking and having a conversation, the encoding will simply be in their minds. They will think, how am I going to say this next bit? If they are writing, they will have to think, what is this next sentence going to say? So encoding it is simply putting it into a form that somebody else can understand, whether it's written or whether it's spoken. It's thinking about what kind of words we will use. If you are talking to the head of finance, you will talk to them in a very different way to the way that you might talk to a child, to a young, to a 4 or 5 year old. You will have to talk to them using different languages. You'll have to talk to them using different lengths of sentences. So you have to think about what you're going to say. One of the things that I find slightly strange when I talk to my sister has a 2-year-old, and if she has been talking to her 2-year-old, when she starts talking to me on the telephone, she starts off by talking to me like she's been talking to her daughter. So her sentences are all very short and very simple, and it takes about 5 minutes before she realises that she's actually talking to another adult, and then she starts changing the way that she speaks to me. So you have to encode your message in a way that somebody will understand, and that's going to be important, the words you use, the way that you say something. Transmitting the message is obviously sending it to the other person. Transmitting the message means you press the button to send your email. You press a button to send a text message. You actually talk to somebody. You pick the phone up and discuss something with them. Transmitting the message is sending it to them. At the other end, somebody else receives it. So you are the sender, you are sending the message to somebody. The other person receives it, and they have to decode it. They have to try and understand what it means. Now, some of you will have received messages from people that you didn't really understand. Maybe your boss has given you some instructions and you didn't really get what the instructions were, you didn't really understand them. In other words, the message hasn't got through properly. Maybe you've received a letter from somebody, particularly from a company, and it isn't really very clear what's going on. So the idea, if we want to be good communicators, is that we actually think this process through before we do anything. Now, one of the things that you will find out when you're doing your ACCA exams, and some of you have already realised this, is that because the exams are in English, and because the exams are written by an examiner, you have to be careful to work out exactly what the exam questions mean. The examiner is somebody who is very knowledgeable, very experienced, very technically qualified, and he's writing exam questions for somebody who isn't qualified, who hasn't got as much experience, and may not even speak the same language. There will be a lot of you for whom English is not your first language. Examiners have to be very careful about the words that they use when they're writing an exam question. If they use the wrong words, students won't understand what they are supposed to do, and they will do it wrong. I have seen this many, many times when I have written exam papers, because I have written exam papers for other people to sit, and I have written a question which makes perfect sense to me, and the students have all done something different, because to them, obviously, they didn't get the same message that I was trying to send them. So we have to be very, very careful. Now, of course, we can check whether people have understood our message by using feedback. If you are talking to somebody, how do you know that they've understood what you are saying? Well, the obvious thing is that they will ask you. They will simply say to you, I didn't understand that. That's obviously giving you a verbal clue that there is a problem. So feedback can simply be somebody saying, I don't understand that. But to be honest with you, in lots of ordinary conversations, we don't even need people to be speaking to us. You can tell by their expressions on their faces. They don't understand what we're saying. They look puzzled. Or they perhaps look defensive. They don't understand what we want. So we can get some feedback. The important thing about feedback is that you get it quickly. So that if there is a problem, if somebody does not understand what you are saying, you can correct it and you can explain it again. Now that's why lots of people prefer speaking to others rather than writing to others. I'm afraid I am one of them. I don't really like sending emails. I would much rather talk to somebody, because then if they don't understand something, we can go through it again straight away. Imagine that I send an email to 1,000 members of staff inside an organisation. How do I know if they've all understood it? It might take a long time for me to get any feedback on it. If I'm a very senior person, if I'm the managing director, there'll be some people I never get any feedback from at all, because perhaps they are worried about admitting to the managing director that they don't understand what I've said. So feedback is very important. We have to have a way of making sure that we can check people have understood what's going on. That is one of the big problems that you get in exam papers. The time that you get the feedback is when the students start doing their answers and sending them in. And of course, by that stage, it's too late to change anything. So that's why exams all go through a lengthy process before they are sat by students. And even then, examiners still ask things and students will misunderstand what they were supposed to do, and really it's too late to do anything about it. So, the communication process. The idea is that the sender has the information, the receiver understands it. Anything that stops that from happening is what's called noise. And when we've got noise, it means that this process is breaking down somewhere. So, it could be, for example, that in the transmission stage, the message was never sent properly. I send somebody a fax and they never receive it, or they don't receive all of it, they only get some of it. The problem there was in the transmission stage. The problem could be in the encoding stage. I didn't really think properly about what I was trying to say, so I used the wrong language. I get various letters from financial organisations. I have pensions because I'm old and things like that. Quite often when I get a letter from an investment company, even though I'm an accountant, they often use language that I don't really understand. So I have an investment that I've had for about 10 years, and my company that I'm invested with writes to me every year, and I never really understand what they're telling me. So the message, the problem is in the encoding stage. They're using the wrong language. It could be in the decoding stage. So it could be that the person who receives the message doesn't really understand it properly. That is why there are some things that travel better than others. If you think about culture, if you think about things like music, films, books, etc., books don't travel as well. And by that I mean that a book that is very popular in English may not be very popular in another language. It loses a lot when it's translated into another language. Films are the same. Films that have got lots of talking in often don't do as well around the world as films that are basically don't have as much story but perhaps have got lots of special effects in, because pictures are the same all over the world but words are different. Again, pop music is the same. Certain types of pop music travel better. They are more universally recognised than others. So if I am going to send a message to lots of different people in lots of different parts of the world, I have to think, can I send one message? And if so, I need to make it simple enough that everybody can understand it. Or do I need to send the same message in lots of different ways so that different people can understand it? And again, that's one thing that people don't think about when they're trying to communicate with others, particularly, I think, when we are doing written communications. When we're sending a text message or an email, often we understand what the message is, but we don't think carefully enough about what the other person will understand. And because it's written, it's more difficult to get the feedback. Now, that is very, very important in lots of situations inside organisations, because there is lots of information that is being passed between people, spoken, written, all the time. And if people aren't understanding it, it could cause major problems for the organisation. Okay, let's have a look at 3 different ways that messages, that information can move. We've got what's called vertical, horizontal and diagonal communication. All of these are examples of formal communication, and I'll say what that is in a minute. Let's imagine that you have the head of finance who sends an email to a junior accountant. Now, those 2 people are in the same department. Ultimately, the head of finance is the boss of the junior accountant. So that is what's called vertical communication. It's in the same department, but it's between somebody senior and somebody junior. If there was some feedback, so the junior accountant responded to this email and wrote back to it, that would still be vertical communication. So vertical communication is up and down. So that one is vertical. Now imagine that the head of finance now goes to a board meeting, a meeting of the board of directors, and is talking to the head of marketing. Now, those two are now equivalent levels. They are both heads of department, but they're in different departments, and that is what's known as horizontal communication. You may well be able to work out already what diagonal communication is going to be. Diagonal communication is going to be people who are at different levels in different departments. So, say for example, the head of marketing has filled in an expense claim form, and the junior accountant is processing it, and there is something that the head of marketing forgot to fill in. Junior accountant phones them up and says, can you just clarify, can you just explain what this particular expense was for, or you forgot to fill that bit in, what do you need to put in there? That is diagonal communication, different levels and different departments. Now, this communication can obviously be spoken, it can be written, it depends what is most appropriate. Now, formal communication is very important inside an organisation, because formal communication is the ones that are decided by the company. So the company, for example, decides we will have a meeting of the board of directors. That's a formal method of communication because you force the board of directors to meet. The finance director, the head of finance, has something that he needs to tell all his department. So she decides that she's going to send an email to everybody because the finance department is connected by email. That again is formal communication because the organisation has decided that's the best way to send these kind of messages. Formal communication tends to be work-based. So we have got various different ways that we can do formal communication. We can have meetings. We can have memos, so written documents. We could have emails. We could have letters. We could have faxes, perhaps even between two different organisations. So the sales manager at one organisation sends a fax to the purchasing manager at a different organisation. That's formal because that's the way that those two companies are actually going to discuss things with each other. So formal communication basically are ways that people have decided is the best way to share this information. Some of you, particularly if you're in a large organisation, will know what these formal communication measures are. If there is something that you need to pass on to somebody, you must tell a certain person who will tell somebody else, who will tell somebody else. So, for example, when I was working as an auditor, which I have mentioned in previous chapters, if there was a problem with the client's accounts, if there was something that we weren't very sure about, we did not go and speak to the client directly. I would tell my manager. If it was serious enough, the manager would tell the partner, and then the partner would talk to the head of the company. So there was a method that we had to go through. I couldn't just go and talk to whatever the problem was. I had to go through a formal communication procedure talking to a certain person who then talked to somebody else and so on. That's what we mean by formal. Informal, on the other hand, is basically what it says there. It's a social thing. People talk when they go to the kitchen to make a cup of coffee. People talk when they're gathering around the water cooler to fill up their mugs, their cups with water. In fact, these kinds of ways of communication are amongst the most powerful in organisations. One group of people that always seem to know what's going on quicker than anybody else is if you have a group of people who smoke. Because they will often go outside the building together, and while they're having a cigarette, they will talk about things, and often they share information with each other before anybody else knows about it. So, informal communication, people like to talk to each other. Now, informal communication there includes things like rumours, include things like gossip. It's something that's sometimes called the grapevine. Please don't ask where that name grapevine comes from because I really don't know. But the grapevine simply means that there are ways that people hear about things even though they haven't been officially told. So we find out that one of our colleagues is getting a promotion because somebody has been told by somebody else who has heard, who's got a friend in the human resources department. And then, about 3 or 4 days later, there is an official email that says, this particular person has got a promotion, and everybody actually already knows about it. So informal communication is very, very powerful. Informal communication is very fast. Rumours spread through organisations very quickly. One of the big problems for a large organisation is making sure that people are not talking about rumours which are factually incorrect. Because often, rumours can be damaging to a company. I have heard that they are going to close this particular division. People in the division get very fed up, they get demotivated, and it turns out that that rumour was actually wrong. Nothing was ever discussed about it. So you need to make sure, if you're a manager, that you think about what are the formal ways that we want to let people know about things, whether they're meetings, whether they're emails, whatever. And also, managers need to make sure they are aware of what is being discussed informally. If something is wrong and people are talking about it, managers need to find out so they can correct what's wrong. Otherwise, people will get demotivated about things. So, formal and informal communication, very, very important. How you decide to tell people. Now, there are various features that you've got as far as effective communication is concerned. This is very similar to what we had in the previous chapter when we talked about training people. I said to you, if you remember, that lots of people don't really think about training. They simply say, I'll show you how to do something, and because they haven't thought about it, they don't do a very good job of it. Communication is the same. It's worth spending a few minutes thinking what is the best way to communicate these ideas with somebody else. So, for example, for communication to be effective, information must be understood by the receiver. There ought to be some way that I can get relatively quick feedback from everybody. I mentioned a few minutes ago the fact that I get this letter from an investment company, and every year they send it and I never understand what it means. Nobody has ever contacted me to say, do you actually understand what's going on? Does this letter actually explain things? Because if they did, then I would probably write back and say, actually, I have no idea what you're talking about. So there's got to be some way of feedback. Talking to people is easier. Writing to people is obviously trickier. So try and build that in. It needs to be sent via an appropriate channel. Should you write something down, or should you simply tell somebody? Well, it all depends. It depends, for example, on the length of what you are going to tell them. So if, for example, I said to you, here is a really good book, and I then proceeded to read the entire book to you, taking 10, 11, 12 hours, that probably would not be an appropriate channel. It's too long. You won't be able to concentrate on it. So how long is the message? Longer messages often need to be written because there is more for people's minds and brains to try and hold on to. How complex is it going to be? Complicated things, it would make sense to write down because then people can keep referring back to them again. So again, what's the best way to communicate something? What's the most appropriate channel? Well, it all depends. Sometimes spoken is better, sometimes texting is better, sometimes emailing is better. It depends on the circumstances. It needs to be exchanged at an appropriate time. You need to give people information while it is still useful. There is no point in going up to somebody and saying the weather yesterday was like this. People are more interested in what's the weather going to be like this evening. what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? Telling them what the weather was like yesterday doesn't actually help them very much. So give people information which is useful and it's given to them at an appropriate time. And finally, how much detail should you give them? Just enough that they can understand things. Too little detail, and they won't really understand what's happening. It's too vague. Too much detail, you might have come across something, which we'll talk about again in a few minutes' time, called information overload. There is so much information, it's so detailed that actually I can't concentrate on what are the really important bits. So give people just enough and no more than that. If you think about it, one of the skills in passing examinations is being able to do that, particularly that last one, to give the marker just enough information so that the marker knows that you understand what's going on without going into so much detail that it takes too long and the marker loses the point that you are trying to make. So, features of effective communication. Now, this is very, very, very important when you're talking about F3 and when you're talking about F2. Because what is F3 all about? Some of you will say F3 is about financial accounting. But what is financial accounting all to do with? Financial accounting is about communicating with the owners of a company. It's about communicating with the shareholders. Now, when you get a bit further on in your studies, you will move beyond doing things like income and expenditure statements. You'll move beyond doing things like balance sheets, statements of the company's position. And you'll start thinking about things like how should the information be presented to the shareholders? How do you actually present an income statement? What goes in what particular order? They are done in a particular way. As you get further through ACCA, when you move up to F7 and when you move up to P2, you will also start talking about the notes to the accounts. So there are various parts of the accounts where just knowing a figure isn't sufficient. So we have to give the user of the accounts, the shareholders, some extra information, and that's buried in the notes of the accounts a little bit further on. So how much information should go in there? And international accounting standards, a lot of them are basically to do with what information should you tell the shareholders. So too much information is bad, too little information is bad. So we have to think about how much we're going to do there. And so if you think about a set of accounts, what you are preparing in paper F3, you have to make sure that they're understood by the shareholders. You have to make sure they're sent via the appropriate channel. Well, to be honest with you, most accounts will be written because they are complicated. So they'll be printed. They have to be exchanged at an appropriate time, once a year, reflecting the year end of the organisation. And they have to be as detailed as is appropriate. Various international accounting standards will tell companies how detailed they have to be. So if you're doing F3, that communication is very important. If you're doing F2, in a certain way, it's even more important, because some of you have already realised, doing management accounting, that because it's for inside an organisation, there are no international accounting standards. You can do whatever you like inside your own company. Management accounting is all about helping the organisation to be run better, to be more efficient, to be more effective. So we have to think about, what do managers need to know? When do they need to know it? How much detail do we need to go into? And if we get any of those things wrong, then all the work that you put into F2, all the numbers that you calculate, will be a complete waste of time. Because either the people you're preparing the information for won't understand it, or it's so detailed that there's too much and they don't understand what they're supposed to look for, Or you spent so long doing it, it's no longer of any use to them. So, okay, in the F2 exam, hopefully it's not as bad as that, but in real life, management accounting, you need to think about all these bits of communication. So this is going to be vitally important for you in your job as an accountant. It's vitally important for any manager speaking to anybody, because you are going to have people who work for you. You must give them information. If you don't give them information, they won't be able to do their jobs properly. If they don't do your jobs properly, you will look like a poor manager. So there are various features that we have for effective communication, and there are also various barriers to ineffective communication that we need to worry about. So, amongst these barriers to effective communication, information overload we have just talked about. I don't know whether any of you at work receive work emails, or to be honest, even in your own life you receive emails. Usually when you go and open your email inbox, there are lots and lots of emails that really haven't got anything to do with you. You have perhaps been sent an email once by an organisation, so they carry on sending you them even though you are no longer interested. One of the big jobs that you have to do is to regularly go through your email and just delete all the stuff that is of no use to you. I would imagine that roughly every day I get about 25 emails, which usually about 24 of them are completely useless to me. So I just spend my time deleting all these emails. At work, it can be even worse. So, information overload. So many emails, which ones are important? And I suspect that I often delete emails or don't read them very carefully that are actually very important, simply because I've got too many to look at. Inappropriate language. Again, if you're talking to somebody, you need to use the right kinds of words. If you are an accountant and you are talking to another accountant, you can use words like depreciation and amortisation because the other accountant will understand you. If you are then talking to the head of the marketing department and you start using the same words, if you start saying to them, well, are you operating the prudence concept or the accruals concept, both of which you should have come across in F3, the manager of marketing will simply say, I don't understand what you're talking about. So it's very easy to use language that we understand, to use technical words that we understand, and forget that other people don't understand them at all. Any of you that come home from work and start talking about what you've done during the day, and you're talking to a friend, to a family member, whoever, and you start using the words that you use at work, you often lose what they're saying. So they won't understand you because they don't use those same words. So use appropriate language. Deliberate distortion. My boss comes to me and says, how is everything going? And I say, everything is going brilliantly well, when in fact it's all going horribly badly. I just don't want to admit that to my boss, and we'll see something similar in a little while. So deliberate distortion, I will perhaps give you some numbers that make it look like my department is doing really well, when in fact I know that they are doing very badly. That's one of the reasons why there are lots of international accounting standards and why accounts are audited, so that companies cannot deliberately distort the figures so that the shareholders are not misled. So it's one of the reasons why everything is audited. Lack of time. Any of you that have ever been talking to somebody else who is in a hurry, they're trying to give you some instructions, they don't really explain things very well because they are trying to leave to go off and do something else, and you end up thinking, I don't really understand what they were talking to me about. That can happen a lot inside companies. People have to do things quickly and they don't have time to explain properly. Conflict. That can almost be like deliberately misunderstanding something. So my sister, who has a 2-year-old daughter, there are times when the 2-year-old, my niece, deliberately misunderstands what her mother is telling. So mother will say, you are going to go to bed in a couple of minutes, and the daughter deliberately misunderstands that and then looks surprised when she's told she's got to go to bed. Yep, so conflict. And finally, similar to the deliberate distortion, fear. The boss explains something to you and says, do you understand? You are worried that if you say no, the boss will think that you're an idiot. So you say, yes, I understand entirely, and in fact, you don't really understand it, but you don't want to admit that. That also happens with bosses. If you explain something to your boss may be very reluctant to admit that they don't understand what you've just said. Because after all, they are your boss. They are supposed to understand what you're saying to them. So fear. There are lots, then, of different reasons why communication is often not as effective as it should be. What we want to try and do is we want to try and get rid of as many of those barriers as we possibly can. Now, what can the workplace do to try and get rid of some of these barriers? Well, there are some of them that, to be honest, they can't do very much about. Can't really do very much about that last one, fear. They can do something about the top one. Some companies have policies on what you are allowed to email and who you are allowed to email it to. It is very easy in some companies just to simply email everybody. And all that happens is that most of the people who receive that email are not in the slightest bit interested. A company I was working for a few years ago had an email that went round to everybody. So it got sent to everybody in the organisation, and then one person replied, but they, instead of pressing reply to just send it back to the person who had originally sent the message, they did reply all, so it went to everybody. So everybody in the company got the reply. Then the original sender sent a reply again to everybody. And so my inbox got clogged up with about 15 messages that were just simply between these two people, and it had nothing to do with anybody else in the entire organisation. The IT department actually then had to send an email to everybody saying, please make sure that you only reply to the person who sent this. Everybody's got all of your messages in their inboxes, and some people now can't access their real email because their inbox is filled up with these messages that they don't actually need to read. So some organisations will actually have policies on who you can send emails to and who you can't send emails to, for exactly that reason. You can talk about the kind of language that should be used, and again, if you're working in a finance department, you might be given guidelines. These are the kind of words that you can use. Managers in other departments might also be given guidelines. These are the kind of words that you can expect the finance department to use, and this is what they mean. So you're trying to get rid of some of those barriers. So you can try and overcome them, although they are difficult to do. So, what are the consequences then if we have poor communication inside an organisation? Demotivated staff. They feel that they don't really know what's going on inside the company. They hear lots of rumours that things are happening, and they never hear the official version, which would put them more at ease. That is a fault of the senior management. They perhaps don't know that these rumours are taking place, and they perhaps aren't fixing them. It can also be demotivating if people are regularly given instructions that they don't understand. Again, that's the senior management's fault. Poor decision making. People at the top of an organisation can only make decisions based on what they are told. If I tell my boss the wrong thing, or I tell my boss something which is out of date, or I miss information out, or I don't tell my boss anything at all, then they're going to make poor decisions. So again, the senior management need to make sure that they're getting all the information at the right time. Staff will be unclear. I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to do, because when the manager explained it, I wasn't really clear what they said. Ideas are not shared. you've got two parts of a company who basically have got the same kind of problems. One of the departments fixes their problem and doesn't tell the other department. So now one department's doing well and the other department is still doing badly. You want them to share their ideas. And finally, social needs aren't being met. Now, to be honest with you, the top 5 of those, the top 4 of them, are actually the important ones, and it's up to the senior managers in the organisation to make sure that everybody is being given information in a form they understand when they need it. It's also up to the senior management to find out all the information they need to make decisions. So if things are going wrong, it's because the senior management haven't thought about this properly. So information is not getting to the right people at the right time. Now, that can be very important for things like projects. If you're doing something like project management, you need to find out what's going on. One of the things that you will have to do is set up some kind of communication process. Who is going to write a report? Who's it going to go to? How often is it going to happen? How is it going to be communicated? So the head of the project might write a weekly update to their boss. So weekly, written, who's writing it, who's it being sent to. That's got to be decided by somebody. If it isn't, then it won't necessarily happen. The project leader won't necessarily do anything, so the people at the top won't know what's happening. Now, there are various different ways in which you can communicate information. You've got verbal, which is obviously spoken. You've got written, obviously written down. Visual. Any of you that use graphs or tables when you are doing some kind of reports or presentations, you're using visual communication instead. The reason why those top 3 are important is different people prefer information in different ways. Any of you who have perhaps sat through a PowerPoint presentation will appreciate that often you get exactly the same information in 3 forms. You will get the raw numbers given to you on a piece of paper, written. At the same time, you will have the numbers displayed on a chart, on a screen, visual, and also at the same time, the speaker will be going through and talking about what the numbers mean and pointing things out. So verbal, you're getting all 3 at once. Why? So that each different kind of person can relate to the way that they process information better. So if you're a visual person, then you've got something that you can understand. A written person, the same thing. So if you have 3 different ways, everybody will understand one of them. The other way that you've got written down there, body language. Body language, not so much in a work-based situation, but certainly in a social situation, body language is one of the most important ways of communicating. It's so important that when people are having a conversation, scientists estimate that the vast bulk of the information that's received is through body language. It's not through what the person is actually saying. And you can demonstrate this very, very easily for yourself. If you are watching a film in a foreign language, you can still often work out roughly what's going on by the way that people act, by the body language they're using, by the expressions that their faces have, by the gestures that they make with their arms. Even though you can't necessarily understand a single word that they are saying, you can still work out what the conversation is about. Body language is that powerful. Now, as far as companies are concerned, the big thing they have to do is to work out what is the best way of communicating any ideas. We have got a number of different diagrams which can be used to summarise this. First of all, we're going to look at 3 different ways of what's called centralised information systems. Centralised means all the information starts with one person. It starts at the centre. So a senior person knows some information, and then how does it get to everybody else? The wheel. In the wheel, the person who has the information tells everybody else in one go. That would be like, in an organisation, the head of finance sending out the monthly reports about spending. The head of finance has all that information and simply emails it to all the other heads of departments. The chain. We start with one person who knows everything, who then tells somebody else, and so on and so on. That is often how information is passed down through an organisation. Head of finance tells their deputy. Deputy then tells the person below them, and so on until it works its way all the way down. The why is similar to that, except towards the bottom, you tell more than one person. Head of finance tells the head of a department. The head of department tells everybody in their department at the same time. So, head of finance tells one person, the head of department tells 5 people all in one go. So, the Y shape. The idea behind all of those is that one person starts with the information and then it gradually works its way to other people. Some of them are faster than others. The wheel is obviously very quick, because as soon as you send that email, everybody has the information they need. The chain is a lot slower, but the chain has the advantage that you can do it verbally, so you can actually talk to the next person in the chain and make sure they understand before it goes on. With the wheel, you can't really do that. With the wheel, because it's quick, you tend to have to send all the information in one go. You can't check with each person they understand it. So they're both good in different ways. Alternatively, we can have what's called decentralised. And decentralised simply means that information can start anywhere. The most obvious one is a wheel. Now, the wheel simply means person 1 tells person 2, tells person 3, tells person 4. But with the wheel, you can start with anybody. Person 3 might be the person who begins. Sometimes it might be person 1 who is the person who begins. But once you begin, you then always go to the same person next. So it always goes one person at a time. I suppose a good example might be if you've got the senior managers in an organisation who are all looking at a report, and so it gets passed from one person to the next, and each person adds their own comments on before they then pass it on to the next person. So it goes through one at a time, but the report could be started by any department. And the final one we've got, what's called the all channel, which, to be honest, is probably fairly obvious by its name. The all channel is simply you start with anybody and you can talk to anybody. So with the all channel, we have any of these 5 places where information can start, and I can communicate it to anybody. The all channel is obviously very good because lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of ideas are shared. That one is very, very prone to becoming a victim of information overload. So in that one, there might well be too many messages. People can't concentrate and focus on what's important. So there are various different ways we can pass information within an organisation. And the organisation has to choose the most appropriate one that's going to work. And it will be different depending what the information is. If it's budgets, you'll use one method, maybe the wheel. If it's talk about redundancies, you might want to use the chain so that you can actually talk to people about what's happening. If it's people just meeting and having a chat while they're having a cigarette, you'll use the all channel. They just gossip to each other. So different things are done in different ways. As a manager, you must think of what's the most appropriate way, and you must make sure that your message is understood by the person that's received it.